My wife and I were shopping at the mall. While I went to get the car, she stepped aside to take a phone call. As I reached the parking lot, an older security guard approached me. "Is that your wife?" he asked. I nodded. Then he lowered his voice and said, "You need to see this." I froze when I saw the footage on his screen. My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old and somehow still trying to process the absolute destruction of my reality. As a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years building commercial high-rises across Atlanta, I thought I knew how to spot a weak foundation. I spent my life calculating load paths and stress points, ensuring that everything I built was safe and secure. But the one thing I failed to inspect was the woman I had been married to for the last 15 years. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and played you for a fool. It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The Georgia heat was oppressive, so Cynthia and I decided to spend the day walking around the air-conditioned luxury of Lenox Square Mall. Cynthia is 65, but she carries herself with the grace and energy of a woman 10 years younger. She was always the picture of a perfect traditional wife. She wore pastel twin sets, organized church charity drives, and always made sure I took my blood pressure medication with a warm cup of tea. I loved her deeply. When I sold my construction firm a few years ago for a very comfortable sum, I promised myself that Cynthia and I would spend our golden years traveling and enjoying the peace we had earned. We had just finished having a quiet lunch at a nice restaurant on the second floor. As we walked toward the exit, Cynthia felt her phone buzz in her designer purse. She glanced at the screen and gave me that sweet, apologetic smile I had fallen in love with 15 years ago. "Richard, honey," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "It is the church planning committee. They are having a crisis with the upcoming bake sale. You know how they panic over everything. Let me just step outside and handle this. Why do you not go ahead and bring the car around so I do not have to walk all the way across the hot asphalt?" It was a completely normal request. I patted her shoulder, told her to take her time, and walked through the heavy glass doors toward the vast parking garage. I was casually searching my pockets for my keys, feeling completely content with my life. That was when I noticed him. An older security guard in a crisp white uniform was standing near the concrete pillars of the parking deck. He had silver hair, weathered skin, and the sharp, observant eyes of a man who had spent decades watching people. As I approached my car, he stepped directly into my path. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice low and tight with urgency. I stopped jingling my keys in my hand. "Can I help you?" I asked, assuming he was going to tell me I had parked in a restricted zone. The guard looked over his shoulder, scanning the area before looking back at me. He pointed a calloused finger toward the far end of the shopping complex. "Is that your wife?" he asked. I followed his gaze. In the distance near the edge of the building, I could just make out Cynthia standing near a service exit. I smiled slightly. "Yes, that is my wife, Cynthia. She is just taking a phone call from her church group." The guard did not smile. His expression grew darker, more serious. He stepped closer to me, bridging the gap between us so no one else could hear. "Sir," he whispered, "you need to see this." He pulled a company-issued tablet from his duty belt. He tapped the screen a few times, pulling up the live feed from one of the external security cameras mounted near the loading docks. It was a restricted area, a blind spot where shoppers never went. It was a narrow alleyway behind a row of heavy industrial dumpsters. I squinted at the screen, not understanding why he was showing me a security feed of garbage bins. But then the camera zoomed in. My breath caught in my throat. It was Cynthia. She was not on the phone with the church planning committee. She was standing in the shadows of the alley, looking around nervously. Her posture was completely different from the relaxed, elegant woman I had just had lunch with. Her shoulders were tense, her movements sharp and calculated. A moment later, a man stepped out from behind the brick enclosure. He was easily 40 years younger than her, dressed in dark clothes with heavy tattoos snaking up his neck and across his hands. He looked like the kind of guy you cross the street to avoid. He moved with a nervous, twitchy energy, constantly checking his surroundings. My mind struggled to process the image. Why on earth was my refined, devout wife meeting a thug in a dark alleyway behind the mall? "Watch closely," the security guard murmured, holding the tablet steady. On the screen, Cynthia opened her expensive leather handbag. She reached inside and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Even through the grainy resolution of the security camera, I could see the distinct shape of banded cash. It was not just a few bills. It was a massive brick of money. She shoved the envelope into the tattooed man's hands. The man quickly checked the contents, nodding in satisfaction. In return, he reached into his jacket. He handed Cynthia two things. First was a sleek, dark folder that looked like it contained legal documents. Cynthia snatched it and shoved it into her bag. Second, he handed her a small glass vial. It had no label, no medical markings. It was just a tiny, dark container. The man said something to her, pointing at the vial with a serious warning gesture, holding up one finger as if emphasizing a specific dosage. Cynthia nodded coldly. She did not look intimidated by him at all. In fact, she looked like she was the one in charge. She slipped the unlabeled vial into her pocket. The man turned and disappeared down the service alley, melting back into the shadows. I stood there in the sweltering parking garage, completely frozen. My lungs felt like they had been filled with wet cement. The tablet screen felt like a window into a parallel universe. This could not be real. The woman on that screen, the woman handing over bricks of cash for mystery vials and secret documents, could not be my Cynthia. But the horror was just beginning. The camera feed showed Cynthia stepping out from behind the dumpsters. She paused near a concrete wall. She opened her purse again and pulled out a small, compact mirror. I watched in absolute sickening disbelief as my wife completely altered her entire physical demeanor. She relaxed her shoulders. She smoothed down her pastel cardigan. She applied a fresh coat of pink lipstick. She practiced a warm, gentle smile in the mirror. In a matter of seconds, she transformed from a calculating conspirator back into the sweet, innocent woman who reminded me to take my blood pressure pills. She turned and began walking back toward the mall entrance, her heels clicking a steady, innocent rhythm on the pavement. The security guard lowered the tablet. He looked at me with deep, profound pity in his eyes. "I have worked here for 20 years, sir," he said quietly. "I know a shady drop when I see one. I saw you two walk out together earlier. I thought you should know who you are driving home with." I could not speak. The world around me started to spin. As a structural engineer, I knew that when a building collapses, it is rarely because of a sudden external impact. It collapses because the foundation has been secretly rotting away for years, unseen and ignored, until the load becomes too heavy to bear. Looking at that blank tablet screen, I realized my entire marriage was a rotting structure. Every kiss, every cup of tea, every loving word was built on a terrifying lie. I did not know what was in that legal folder. I did not know what was in that unlabeled glass vial. But my gut told me it was meant for me. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, echoing in my ears like a warning siren. I had to force myself to breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run back to the mall entrance, to grab her by the shoulders and demand to know what she had just purchased in that alleyway. I wanted to shake the truth out of her. But my analytical mind, the mind that had successfully managed multi-million-dollar construction projects and navigated countless corporate betrayals, forced me to stay perfectly still. If I confronted her right now in the middle of the parking lot, she would simply lie. She was clearly a master of deception. She would invent a brilliant excuse. She would tell me the money was for a secret charity case. She would claim the vial was just a special essential oil for my joints. She would cry and make me feel like a paranoid old fool. And worse, I would have tipped my hand. I would have shown her that I was on to her game. I thanked the guard, slipping him a $100 bill from my wallet, and made him promise to keep this strictly between us. He nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation. I walked toward my car, my hands shaking so violently I could barely unlock the door. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the steering wheel. I had to be smart. I had to be an engineer. I had to map out this crumbling foundation, find the structural flaw, and exploit it before it completely crushed me. I took a deep, trembling breath, turned the key in the ignition, and prepared myself to look into the eyes of a monster disguised as my wife. I pulled my sedan out of the parking space. The leather steering wheel felt slippery under my palms. Cold sweat coated my forehead. I steered my car toward the main entrance of the Lenox Square Mall, navigating through the slow-moving traffic. My mind was racing, trying to process the impossible images I had witnessed on the security guard screen. Every instinct told me to hit the gas to drive away and never look back. But I had to play the game. I had to be the clueless, loving husband. I spotted her waiting by the glass doors. Cynthia. She looked immaculate in her pastel yellow cardigan and tailored white trousers. Her silver blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, not a strand out of place despite the humid Georgia heat. She held her designer handbag loosely over one arm, the very same bag that currently held a thick folder of unknown legal documents and a vial of God knows what. As I pulled up to the curb, she offered me a bright, warm smile. It was the smile that had welcomed me home for 15 years. The smile I trusted implicitly. She slid into the leather seat, bringing a cloud of expensive floral perfume. "Thank you, darling," she said, leaning over to give me a soft peck on the cheek. "It is absolutely sweltering out there. I am so glad you went to get the car." "Of course," I replied. I feared she would hear the tremor in my voice. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the long road ahead as I merged onto the busy avenue heading north. "You are an absolute lifesaver, Richard." She continued, settling back into her seat with a contented sigh. I swear walking across that parking lot would have ruined my afternoon. I nodded mechanically, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The drive from the mall back to our estate in the affluent northern suburbs of Atlanta usually took 40 minutes. Today it felt like an agonizing march toward the gallows. As the cityscape gave way to towering pine trees and sprawling manicured lawns, my thoughts drifted to the life I had built. For 40 years I had poured my blood, sweat, and soul into Caldwell Construction. I had started with a used pickup truck and an engineering degree. I spent decades waking up before dawn, walking dusty job sites, calculating load distributions, and pouring concrete foundations that would hold the weight of skyscrapers. I built an empire piece by piece, brick by brick. When I finally sold the company 3 years ago, I walked away with tens of millions of dollars. It was more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I had thought my battles were over. I had thought I had earned the right to lower my guard. I married Cynthia 15 years ago because she represented everything my chaotic business life lacked. She was calm, gentle, deeply involved in her church, and seemingly devoted entirely to creating a peaceful home. She never asked about the corporate accounts. She never demanded to see the balance sheets. She seemed perfectly content tending to her garden and organizing charity drives. I believed she was my sanctuary. I believed my wealth was secure, my legacy protected, and my heart safe. Now staring at the winding asphalt ahead, I realized I had made the most amateur mistake a builder could make. I had trusted a facade without ever inspecting the core structure. Cynthia adjusted the air conditioning vent, humming to a soft jazz tune playing on the radio. "Oh, I almost forgot," she said, turning her body slightly toward me. "Pastor Miller called while you were getting the car. The planning committee for the annual bake sale is in an absolute frenzy. Susan forgot to order the specialty boxes for the pastries, and now they are expecting me to perform a miracle before Sunday." She let out a light musical laugh. It was a flawless performance. If I had not seen her standing in that dingy alleyway, exchanging a brick of cash for a mysterious vial, I would have believed every single word. I would have chuckled along with her, told her she was indeed a miracle worker, and patted her knee. Instead, a cold wave of disgust washed over me. I kept my eyes glued to the taillights of the car in front of us. "That sounds stressful," I managed to say, keeping my tone perfectly flat and conversational. "Did you manage to sort it out?" You know me, she replied, waving her manicured hand dismissively. I made a few calls. I smoothed out the ruffled feathers. It is nothing I cannot handle. I swallowed the bitter taste pooling in the back of my throat. She handled it all right. She handled a tattooed thug behind a dumpster. I needed to test the waters. I needed to see just how easily the lies rolled off her tongue when directly challenged. So I began keeping my voice casual, as if making idle small talk. Did you find anything interesting in the shops you were gone for quite a while? Cynthia did not flinch. She did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. She turned her head, offering me a look of pure, unadulterated innocence. No, not really, she said smoothly. Just window shopping, honey. I looked at a few dresses in the department store, but nothing caught my eye. You know how picky I am with fabrics. Just window shopping. The sheer audacity of the lie struck me like a physical blow. She sat there smelling of fresh perfume, looking like the epitome of a loving, devoted wife while carrying a vial of illicit chemicals in her purse. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much to bear. How many times had she lied to me with that exact same sweet smile? How many times had I blindly accepted her words because I loved her? That is a shame, I replied, forcing a small nod. Maybe next time. Maybe she agreed, turning her attention back to the passing scenery outside the window. The rest of the drive passed in a suffocating silence. The radio continued to play cheerful melodies, a grotesque soundtrack to the collapse of my reality. Every mile we covered brought us closer to the house I had purchased for us. The sprawling estate I designed to be our forever home featured vaulted ceilings and a security system. I thought it was a fortress protecting us. Now I realized I was locking myself inside a cage with a predator. We turned onto our private tree-lined street. The massive wrought iron gates of our property loomed ahead. I pressed the button on the visor, and the gates swung open slowly, welcoming us in. As the tires crunched over the pristine gravel driveway, I looked at the beautiful stone facade of the house. I had paid for every single stone. I had funded the lush landscaping. I had provided the money that allowed Cynthia to live a life of absolute luxury. And somewhere in that beautiful house, she was going to attempt to use that vial to destroy me. I parked the car in the spacious garage and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the central air conditioning. I walked into the kitchen and found Cynthia standing by the marble island. She had already taken off her cardigan and was arranging some fresh-cut flowers in a crystal vase. The afternoon sun streamed through the large bay windows, casting a golden glow over the expensive countertops. And there, right next to the cutting board, sat the tiny dark glass vial I had seen in the mall parking lot. My stomach tightened, but I forced my facial expression to remain completely neutral. I walked over to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of cold water. I took a long drink, allowing the icy liquid to soothe my dry throat. Cynthia turned around and offered me a brilliant smile. She asked me how the drive was, and I lied, saying the traffic was surprisingly light. I stepped closer to the island, my eyes lingering on the small container. I pointed at it with a casual gesture and asked what she had bought from the small store on our trip. Cynthia did not miss a single beat. She reached out and picked up the dark glass vial, holding it gently between her manicured fingers. "Oh, this," she said, her voice dripping with pure affection. "This is a special organic herbal supplement I got for you. A woman from my church planning committee highly recommended it. She told me it works absolute wonders for chronic headaches. You have been complaining about those terrible migraines lately. Richard and I have been so worried about your health. I thought this natural remedy might give you some much-needed relief from the severe pain." I stared at her face, searching for any sign of deception. There was absolutely nothing. Her eyes radiated pure, loving concern. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She had just purchased that vial from a criminal in an alleyway, and now she was presenting it to me as a gift of wifely devotion. The sheer calculation behind her gentle tone made my blood run cold. I managed to produce a perfect, grateful smile, thanking her for being so incredibly thoughtful. I told her she always knew exactly how to take care of me, even when I was being exceedingly stubborn. Cynthia beamed and walked over to the stove. She turned on the burner and placed the silver kettle over the blue flame. She announced that she was going to brew us some chamomile tea so we could relax before dinner. I stood by the island, watching her every single move. She retrieved 2 porcelain mugs from the cabinet and placed them on the counter. When the kettle whistled, she poured the steaming water over the tea bags. Then she picked up the dark vial. She unscrewed the dropper and carefully squeezed 3 precise drops into my designated porcelain tea mug. She stirred the liquid with a small silver spoon and carried the mug over to me. "Drink this while it is hot, honey," she murmured, stroking my arm with a soft, comforting touch. "The herbal supplement needs to dissolve properly to be effective." I took the warm mug from her hands. The aroma of chamomile masked whatever chemical was floating in the water. I brought the rim to my lips and blew softly on the surface. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. I needed to get rid of the tea, and I needed to secure that dark vial. Just then, the loud buzzer on the digital oven timer went off. Cynthia gasped and quickly turned her back to me, rushing toward the stove to check on the roast she had started earlier. It was the perfect opportunity. I did not hesitate for a single second. I stepped sideways toward the large, decorative potted fern sitting at the edge of the kitchen counter. With a swift, silent motion, I dumped the entire contents of my mug into the dark soil. I quickly brought the empty mug back to my lips, just as she turned around to face me completely. She smiled, seeing this mug tilted back. "Did you drink it all?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of eager anticipation. I lowered the mug and let out a satisfied sigh, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. Every last drop I lied smoothly. It actually tasted quite pleasant. "Thank you for worrying about me, my love." She looked incredibly pleased with herself. She took the empty mug from my hands and placed it into the stainless steel sink. I watched her, feeling a deep, sickening sense of validation. My gut feeling had been absolutely perfectly right. She turned her attention back to the oven, opening the heavy door to baste the meat. The sizzling sound of hot oil filled the room. The dark vial was still sitting on the island unattended. I knew I needed physical evidence if I was going to uncover the absolute truth. I needed to know exactly what kind of poison she was feeding me under the guise of an organic supplement. Moving with the quiet precision I had developed over years of inspecting fragile job sites, I reached out and slid the tiny glass container directly into my deep trouser pocket. My heart pounded fiercely as the cool glass settled against my leg. I took a step back from the counter just as Cynthia closed the oven door and turned around. She wiped her hands on a towel and looked at the empty space on the marble island. A brief flash of confusion crossed her delicate features. "Where did I put that herbal supplement?" she muttered, looking around the clean counter. I shrugged, playing the part of the oblivious husband perfectly. "You probably put it away in the medicine cabinet already," I suggested. "You know how quickly you tidy up things." She frowned slightly, opening a few drawers to check. "Yes, I suppose I must have," she said, though her voice lacked its usual bright confidence. "It does not matter anyway. As long as you got your full dose for today, I am totally happy." I felt a cold chill radiate through my entire body at those specific words. My dose for today. How long had this nightmare been going on? How many weeks had she been quietly slipping this unknown toxic substance into my daily meals and drinks? The recent terrible brain fog, the uncharacteristic fatigue, the blinding sharp migraines. Everything suddenly started making absolutely terrifying sense to my sharp analytical mind. I excused myself politely, telling her I was going to wash up before we ate dinner. As I walked down the long, silent hallway toward the master bathroom, the weight of the glass vial in my pocket felt heavier than a solid brick of lead. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me and leaned against the sink, staring intensely at my reflection in the bright mirror. The man looking back at me was 70 years old, tired but far from completely defeated. I was now absolutely ready. The morning sun pierced through the heavy silk drapes of our master bedroom, striking my face with an almost painful intensity. I opened my eyes expecting to feel rested, but instead, a wave of profound nausea washed over me. My limbs felt like they were cast in solid lead. A thick, suffocating fog clouded my brain, making it difficult to even sit up. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress, gripping the nightstand to steady myself. The room spun for a terrifying moment. I had not taken a single drop of Cynthia's special herbal tea the night before, yet my body was still reeling from the lingering effects of whatever poison she had been feeding me for weeks. The realization was a cold, sharp knife to my chest. The heavy metals and sedatives were already in my system, accumulated over time, slowly degrading my motor skills and my memory just as she had planned. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing myself to stand. I needed to remain completely lucid. I could not afford to let the physical weakness show. I walked into the attached master bathroom, splashed freezing water onto my face, and stared at my pale reflection. Today was going to require every ounce of strength I had left. I dressed quickly, in a simple button-down shirt and slacks projecting an image of calm normalcy. I walked down the carpeted stairs, my hand gripping the mahogany railing tightly to hide my unsteadiness. The house was quiet. Cynthia was nowhere to be seen. I made my way to my private study, a room lined with heavy oak bookshelves and the framed blueprints of the commercial high-rises I had built over my long career. I sat behind my desk and opened my tablet. It was the 15th of the month, which meant it was time to handle the routine property tax payments for a few of the commercial parcels I still owned around the city. It was a mundane task, something I usually did over my morning coffee without a second thought. I tapped the screen, opened my secure banking application, and logged into the primary joint account I shared with Cynthia. I navigated to the transfer page, ready to type in the standard amount. Then my eyes locked onto the main dashboard. The available balance was completely wrong. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, thinking my vision was simply blurred from the lingering brain fog. But the digital numbers on the glowing screen did not change. Exactly $50,000 had been withdrawn from our primary liquid cash reserve. My chest tightened as I quickly clicked on the recent transaction history to pull up the detailed receipt. There it was, sitting at the very top of the ledger. A direct wire transfer for $50,000 flat. I checked the timestamp and felt a chill radiate down my spine. The transfer had been initiated at 2 a.m. While I had been asleep, heavily sedated by the remnants of her toxic concoction, the woman I married had been wide awake, moving a small fortune out of our secure account. I stared at the routing destination. It was not a charity. It was not a vendor. It was an external account that I did not immediately recognize. The sheer brazenness of the theft was staggering. She had literally just handed a thick envelope of cash to a criminal in an alleyway, and hours later she was draining our digital reserves in the dead of night. I pushed my chair back, the sound of the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. The time for silent observation was over. I needed to see how she would react when directly challenged. I grabbed the tablet and marched out of the study, my fatigue entirely replaced by a burning, focused adrenaline. I found Cynthia in the main hallway near the front foyer. She was humming a soft church hymn, polishing an antique silver vase with a microfiber cloth. She looked up as I approached, her face instantly breaking into that familiar, radiant, perfectly practiced smile. "Good morning, my love," she said sweetly. "Did you sleep well?" I did not return the smile. I stopped 2 feet away from her, holding the tablet up so the bright screen faced her directly. "Cynthia," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and level. "I was just paying the quarterly property taxes, and I noticed a massive discrepancy in our main ledger." She tilted her head, her smile faltering just a fraction, playing the role of the confused spouse beautifully. "A discrepancy?" she asked, her voice light and unconcerned. "What do you mean, Richard? Did the bank make another silly computing error?" I pointed a stiff finger at the glowing transaction line on the screen. "Someone wired $50,000 out of our account at 2 a.m. Do you know anything about this?" For a split second, the mask slipped. I saw a micro-expression of pure, unadulterated panic flash across her eyes. But Cynthia was a master manipulator. Before I could even blink, her face crumpled into a mask of deep distress. Her bottom lip began to tremble, and genuine tears rapidly pooled in her eyes. $50,000, she gasped, pressing a hand against her chest as if she had just been physically struck. Richard, that is terrible. Have we been hacked? We need to call the fraud department immediately. You know I am terrible with technology. I do not even know how to set up a wire transfer. I watched the tears spill over her eyelashes and trace down her cheeks. It was an incredibly convincing performance. If I had not seen her paying off a street thug less than 24 hours ago, I would have dropped the tablet and pulled her into my arms to comfort her. But I stood completely still, letting the heavy silence stretch between us. Cynthia stepped closer, reaching out to grasp my forearm with trembling fingers. Richard. You are scaring me, she whimpered, her voice cracking perfectly. Why are you looking at me like that? You do not actually think I would do something like this, do you? I looked down at her delicate hand clutching my sleeve. She was waiting for me to back down, waiting for the frail, trusting old man to apologize for his harsh tone. I opened my mouth to press the issue, to demand the truth about the missing funds and the dark vial. Before a single word could leave my lips, the heavy mahogany front door suddenly clicked and swung wide open. The bright morning light spilled into the foyer, casting two long shadows across the polished marble floor. I turned my head. Walking through the doorway was Derek, my 42-year-old stepson, holding a cardboard tray of expensive coffees. Behind him was his wife, Monica, carrying a pastry box. Derek stopped in his tracks, his dark eyes darting from my stern face to his mother and her tear-streaked cheeks. The perfectly timed interruption hung heavy in the warm air. The panicked look on his face told me everything. Derek stepped fully into the foyer, his eyes darting between my raised tablet and the tear-stained face of Cynthia. He was a tall man dressed in a sharp, tailored suit paid for with the generous allowance he drew from my company. He handed the pastry box to Monica, whose smile always seemed entirely too bright and too hollow. Derek closed the heavy front door, sealing us inside the quiet tension of the hallway. He moved with a practiced calmness, approaching his mother and placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Cynthia leaned into him, letting out a fragile sob that made my stomach churn. She was a phenomenal actress, transitioning from a cornered thief to a misunderstood wife in seconds. Is everything all right in here? Derek asked, turning his dark eyes toward me. His tone was perfectly modulated to project innocent concern. Mom looks like she is about to collapse, Richard. What is going on? I held my ground, keeping my posture rigid. I was looking over our banking statements, I said, keeping my voice steady. Someone initiated a wire transfer of $50,000 at 2 in the morning. Cynthia claims she knows nothing about it and thinks our accounts have been compromised. I was about to call the fraud department to freeze our assets. For a fraction of a second, I saw a minuscule tightening around the jaw of Derek, a rapid exchange of glances between him and Cynthia. It was the look of conspirators realizing a critical part of their operation had been exposed. But Derek let out a loud chuckle, shaking his head, as if I had told a deeply amusing joke. Oh, Richard, Derek said, walking toward me with his hands raised in a calming gesture. There is no need to call the bank or panic about hackers. The accounts are perfectly safe. I narrowed my eyes. Then perhaps you can explain where $50,000 went in the middle of the night, I challenged him. Derek sighed, adopting the patronizing tone of a parent speaking to a confused toddler. Dad, he said, using the affectionate title that suddenly felt like a sharp insult. We talked about this just last week. Do you not remember? Remember what I asked? The roof repairs on my house, Derek replied smoothly. You and Mom came over for dinner last Tuesday. I showed you the severe water damage in the guest bedroom ceiling. We stood in the driveway, and you told me the entire roof structure needed to be replaced. You explicitly told Mom to wire the funds to my contractor to cover the emergency repairs. You insisted on taking care of it because you wanted Monica and me to be safe. Cynthia gasped softly, pressing her hands to her cheeks. "Oh my goodness," she cried out, her voice fluttering with relief. "Yes, the roof. Richard, honey, Derek is entirely right. We sat right there in their dining room and you told me to handle the transfer. I scheduled the wire last night because I had forgotten to do it earlier." How could we have both forgotten that conversation? Derek stepped closer, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "It is all right, Dad," he said softly, analyzing my face. "Your memory has been really slipping lately. You have been so forgetful these past few weeks, misplacing your keys, forgetting appointments. It is completely natural at your age to get a little confused. We are just glad you have Mom to help you keep everything organized." I stood perfectly still under the weight of his hand. My mind was a whirlwind of calculations, but my exterior remained frozen. I am a structural engineer. I spent 4 decades designing and building massive commercial structures. I know the exact market price of raw materials and labor down to the penny. Derek lived in a standard suburban house. A complete replacement of a residential roof of that specific square footage would cost $15,000 at the absolute maximum. Even with premium shingles and extensive water damage repair, the final invoice would never exceed $20,000. $50,000 for a residential roof repair was a blatant, laughable lie. It was an absurd fabrication that only someone entirely ignorant of construction costs would ever believe. But Derek did not know I still retained my sharp, analytical mind. He assumed I was already a deteriorating old man. The pieces of their sinister puzzle rapidly clicked into place. The unexplained $50,000 transfer was not for a roof. It was likely a direct payment to the tattooed man in the alleyway, or funding for whatever illicit operation they were running. They were actively gaslighting me. They were using my manufactured symptoms, the brain fog, the fatigue, the migraines caused by the toxic drops Cynthia was pouring into my tea, to convince me that my cognitive functions were failing. They were testing my mental acuity right here in the hallway. They wanted to see if their poison was working. They wanted to see if I was confused enough to simply accept a ridiculous financial lie without putting up a fight. If I pushed back, if I demanded to see the contractor invoices, I would immediately signal that my mind was sharp. I would force them to accelerate their timeline, or worse, increase the dosage of the lethal chemical cocktail hidden in my pocket. I had to play the game. I slowly lowered the tablet, letting my shoulders slump forward to mimic the posture of a defeated, deeply confused old man. I allowed my eyes to wander aimlessly for a brief moment. I raised my free hand to my forehead, rubbing my temples as if battling a sudden, disorienting wave of exhaustion. "The roof," I muttered, my voice intentionally trembling, sounding weak and uncertain. "The roof repairs for your house. I stood in the driveway with you." "Yes, Dad," Derek said softly, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Do you really not remember any of that conversation?" I let out a heavy sigh, shaking my head slowly. I forced a look of deep vulnerability and embarrassment onto my face. "No," I whispered, staring down at the marble floor. "No, Derek. I completely forgot. I do not know what is wrong with me lately. My mind has just been so incredibly foggy. I saw the money missing and I just panicked. I am so sorry for raising my voice." Cynthia immediately rushed forward, enveloping me in a suffocating embrace. "Oh, Richard," she murmured, resting her head against my chest. "Do not apologize, my sweet husband. It is perfectly okay. We know you are just tired. You have been dealing with those awful headaches, and it is making you forgetful. We just want you to rest." I wrapped my arms around her waist, returning the embrace with artificial affection. Over her shoulder, I saw Derek exchange a victorious look with Monica. Monica offered a wicked smile, silently confirming their shared triumph. They fully believed they had successfully outsmarted me. Well, Derek said cheerfully, clapping his hands together. Now that silly little misunderstanding is cleared up, why do we not all go inside to enjoy pastries? I sat at the grand dining table dutifully eating a flaky almond pastry and sipping black coffee. Cynthia fluttered around the room playing the role of the incredibly patient and attentive wife. She continuously poured more coffee into my cup, offering gentle smiles that now made my skin crawl. Derek and Monica sat across from me speaking in slightly elevated voices, the way one might talk to a simple child. They discussed mundane neighborhood gossip and the fictional roof repairs effortlessly weaving their web of lies. I chewed my food mechanically, nodding at appropriate intervals, offering them the exact vacant expression they expected to see. Inside my mind, a furious storm was raging. Every structural pillar of my life had been compromised. I finished my pastry, carefully wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, and pushed my chair back from the table. I announced that I needed to go upstairs to gather my clubs for my weekly golf game with the retired engineers from my country club. Cynthia immediately rushed to my side, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. She asked if I was absolutely sure I felt up to driving, suggesting that perhaps I should rest instead. I offered her a tired but reassuring smile, telling her that the fresh air and sunshine would do me some good and that the routine would help clear my foggy head. Derek gave a supportive nod, encouraging me to go out and enjoy my day. I walked up the grand staircase, gripping the heavy wooden banister, feeling the weight of the dark glass vial resting securely in my deep trouser pocket. I changed into my standard golf attire, grabbed my leather club bag from the master closet, and headed out to the garage. The moment my luxury sedan cleared the heavy wrought iron gates of our estate, my entire physical demeanor completely shifted. The slumped shoulders straightened. The manufactured haze of confusion instantly evaporated. My mind snapped back into sharp, calculating focus. I did not drive toward the pristine greens of the suburban country club. Instead, I merged onto the busy interstate highway, pushing my car toward the towering skyline of downtown Atlanta. The midday traffic was dense, but my grip on the steering wheel remained absolutely steady. I had spent the previous evening quietly researching independent medical facilities that operated outside the standard hospital networks. I needed a place that asked very few questions and valued absolute discretion. 30 minutes later, I pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek medical professional building. I took the private elevator up to the 4th floor, stepping into the quiet, sterile reception area of a premier independent toxicology laboratory. The waiting room was empty, save for a young woman sitting behind a thick glass partition. I approached the counter, my face a mask of determined resolve. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the tiny unlabeled dark glass vial, and placed it carefully onto the polished counter. I told the receptionist I needed a comprehensive chemical analysis of the liquid inside that container. I explained that I needed to know every single molecular compound, every trace heavy metal, and every active pharmaceutical ingredient present. She looked at the mysterious vial, then back up at my stern face. She informed me that a full spectrum analysis typically took up to 2 full weeks to process properly. I pulled out my sleek leather wallet, extracted a heavy stack of crisp $100 bills, and slid them across the counter. I asked her exactly how much it would cost to bypass the standard queue and have the definitive results in my hands within 48 hours. The receptionist stared at the thick stack of cash, her eyes widening slightly. She quickly consulted her computer monitor, typing a few commands before nodding in agreement. She handed me a set of confidential intake forms. I filled them out using a slightly altered version of my name and a secure post office box address I had maintained for years. I was not going to leave any paper trail linking this investigation back to my primary residence. I walked out of the sterile building and descended back into the dimly lit underground parking garage. The heavy concrete walls echoed with the sound of my dress shoes striking the pavement. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, letting the deep silence of the vehicle wash over me. The vial was now in the hands of professionals. Soon I would possess undeniable scientific proof of whatever lethal substance Cynthia had been secretly administering to me. But as I stared at the dark concrete wall ahead, a new, far more terrifying thought slowly began to materialize in my sharp analytical mind. The $50,000 wire transfer was an incredibly bold move. It required a level of financial access that extended far beyond our standard joint checking accounts. If Cynthia and Derek were comfortable enough to openly steal $50,000 in the middle of the night, while simultaneously gaslighting me about roof repairs, their ambitions were likely much larger. They were not just after petty cash. They were actively orchestrating a complete takeover of my entire financial portfolio. My thoughts immediately snapped to Caldwell Holdings. When I retired, I stepped down from the daily operations of my massive construction empire, but I retained a substantial controlling interest and ultimate executive authority over the corporate asset management division. A year ago, under the guise of wanting to learn the family business, Derek had asked to shadow the financial team. I had foolishly granted him a mid-level administrative access pass to help review routine vendor contracts. I had thought I was mentoring him. Now, sitting in the cold shadows of the parking garage, I realized I had essentially handed a hungry wolf the spare keys to the meat locker. I needed to see exactly what he had been doing inside my company network, but I could not use my personal smartphone or my home computer. Derek was technically savvy. He had likely installed tracking software or keystroke loggers on all my personal electronic devices to monitor my actions and intercept my communications. I immediately started the engine and drove out of the parking structure, merging back into chaotic city traffic. I navigated toward a massive electronics retail store located on the outer edge of the metropolitan district. I walked through the sliding glass doors, bypassing the displays of brightly colored televisions and shiny cellular phones. I approached a young sales associate and requested a brand new high-performance laptop computer in a sealed box. I also asked for a prepaid, untraceable mobile internet hotspot device. I carried the items to the main register, deliberately keeping my head down to avoid the overhead security cameras. When the cashier stated the final total, I reached into my wallet and paid for the entire purchase using untraceable cash. I carried the heavy plastic shopping bag back to my sedan, tossing it onto the passenger seat. I now possessed the secure tools required to bypass any surveillance Derek had established. I was about to dive deep into the digital archives of my own company. I drove a few miles away from the electronics store, deliberately choosing a busy, unremarkable coffee shop nestled in a strip mall. I needed a place where an older man typing on a computer would blend perfectly into the background scenery. I ordered a black coffee, took a seat in a secluded corner booth facing the door, and unboxed the new machine. The cafe was filled with the low hum of casual conversations, the clinking of ceramic mugs, and the hiss of the espresso machine. It was a perfectly ordinary afternoon for everyone else in the room. For me, it was the moment of reckoning. I powered on the laptop, bypassed the standard setup prompts, and connected the prepaid internet hotspot device. My hands were remarkably steady now. The initial shock and panic had entirely burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. I opened a secure web browser and typed in the internal portal address for Caldwell Holdings. When I sold the controlling interest of my construction empire, I legally stepped down from the primary board of directors. Derek had eagerly assumed the mantle of managing the day-to-day financial operations, assuring me that he would protect the legacy I had built from nothing. He had proudly informed me months ago that he had updated the corporate security protocols, effectively locking out all legacy accounts, including my own, to prevent cyber threats. He thought he was incredibly clever. He thought he had severed my final digital tie to the company. What Derek completely failed to realize was that I am an engineer. I design systems from the foundation up. When I originally commissioned the custom software architecture for Caldwell Holdings over a decade ago, I mandated the creation of a master founder-level backdoor access protocol. It was a fail-safe mechanism completely unattached to the standard employee registry. Derek had secured the front doors and boarded up the windows, but he had left the underground concrete bunker wide open. I typed in my sequence of specialized credentials. The screen paused for a fraction of a second, and then the familiar blue and silver dashboard of the Caldwell Holdings central mainframe materialized before my eyes. I was inside. I took a slow sip of my dark coffee, my eyes scanning the heavily populated menus. I bypassed the standard public ledgers and the routine operational files. I went straight for the encrypted administrative financial sectors. If Derek was moving money, he would bury it deep within the restricted corporate tax folders. I systematically sorted through the directories, filtering the data by recent administrative modifications. It did not take long for me to find the anomaly. Nestled beneath layers of mundane vendor contracts and quarterly payroll reports, I located a completely hidden directory. It was labeled with a string of innocuous alphanumeric characters designed to look like a redundant system file. I clicked the folder. A prompt appeared demanding a secondary administrative password. I used a brute force override code I had programmed into the system years ago. The folder unlocked, spilling its contents across my screen. My breath caught in my throat as I began to read the file names. I clicked on the first spreadsheet, a master ledger of recent financial movements. The $50,000 wire transfer from my personal account, the one Cynthia had orchestrated at 2 a.m, was logged right there. But it was completely dwarfed by the surrounding transactions. Derek had not just stolen a few $1,000s to cover a lavish lifestyle. He had systematically utilized the pristine credit rating of Caldwell Holdings to secure massive high-interest corporate loans from unregulated shadow lenders. I opened a series of complex loan agreements, scanning the dense legal jargon with mounting horror. These were not standard commercial bank loans. They were highly predatory, incredibly risky financial instruments designed for desperate companies facing imminent bankruptcy. Derek was bleeding the company dry, funneling millions of dollars into external accounts I could not immediately trace. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I had spent 40 years ensuring that Caldwell Construction operated with absolute fiscal responsibility. I had paid every worker on time, honored every contract, and never missed a single loan payment. Now, in the span of a few short months, my stepson had compromised everything. I clicked on the most recent loan document, a staggering commercial note for $7 million. I scrolled down to the final page, searching for the authorization signatures. What I saw made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. There, sitting neatly on the digital signature line, was my name. It was not a clumsy imitation. It was an exact pixel-perfect replication of my authorized digital signature. Derek had stolen my digital encryption key. Every single fraudulent contract, every massive high-interest loan, every illegal transfer of corporate funds bore my explicit authorization. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal threatened to crush me. He was not just stealing my money. He was intentionally framing me for catastrophic financial crimes. If these predatory loans defaulted, if the shadow lenders came to collect, or if the federal regulators audited the company, Derek would walk away completely clean. The paper trail would lead directly back to me. The authorities would see a retired, wealthy founder secretly bankrupting his own company. I would lose my home, my remaining assets, and quite possibly my freedom. I would spend the rest of my life rotting in a federal prison, while Derek and Cynthia enjoyed the millions they had successfully embezzled. I stared at the glowing screen, my hands resting heavily on the keyboard. The depth of their malice was almost impossible to comprehend. Cynthia poisoning my body to degrade my mind. Derek forging my signature to steal my life's work. They were working together, a perfectly synchronized machine designed to eliminate me and consume my wealth. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the intense burning rage wash over me. It was a pure, clarifying anger. They had severely underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. I opened my eyes, ready to download every single file onto my secure hard drive. I needed to copy all the evidence before Derek realized the system had been breached. I reached for the trackpad, but before my finger could even make contact, a small bright red notification bell chimed softly through the laptop speakers. A dialog box suddenly popped up in the upper right corner of the dashboard monitor. It was an active live system alert from the primary financial processing server. My heart slammed against my ribs as I read the incoming text. Derek was currently logged into the network. He was actively initiating a brand new expedited loan application at this exact moment. I stared at the requested transaction amount flashing across the screen in bold green numbers. $15 million. The sheer audacity of the pending wire transfer stole the air from my lungs. If this massive loan was approved and routed through my compromised accounts, the resulting financial devastation would be absolute and entirely irreversible. I had to stop him before he finalized the pending submission. Immediately, my fingers flew rapidly across the heavy keyboard, executing complex commands without hesitation. With my founder-level override, I did not just freeze the transaction. I enacted a complete phantom lockdown on the application process. To Derek, it would simply just look like the commercial banking server was experiencing a routine maintenance delay. He would not suspect a targeted corporate breach. He would just think the commercial banking system was inexplicably slow today. I shut down the laptop, packed it securely into the plastic bag alongside the micro cameras I had purchased, and confidently walked out of the coffee shop. The terrible storm was coming, and I needed to control the lightning. I slowly drove back to the sprawling estate, taking deep, calculated breaths to steady my racing heart. When I walked through the heavy wooden front doors, I perfectly adopted the persona of the weary, confused old man they fully expected to see. Cynthia and Derek were sitting in the living room sharing a pot of tea. They looked up as I entered, their expressions morphing into masks of polite concern. I slumped heavily into a large brown leather armchair, rubbing my eyes. I let out a long, pathetic, deep, and ragged sigh. I began keeping my voice low and vulnerable. I think you both were right earlier. My memory is definitely slipping. My mind and my head feels so terribly clouded lately. The stress of being around the house is just making it worse. I think I desperately need to get away for a few days to clear my mind. Cynthia immediately set her fragile teacup down, her smooth face a perfect picture of marital devotion. "Oh, Richard, where would you go?" she asked softly, her brow furrowing with false worry. I told them I was going to take the boat out to Lake Lanier for a 3-day fishing trip with a few of the retired guys from the country club. I said I just needed some fresh air and absolute quiet to rest my failing memory. As I spoke those words, I watched them closely. Derek slowly raised his teacup to his lips, but not before I caught the brief, triumphant glance he deliberately shot toward his mother. It was a look of pure, unadulterated victory. They genuinely believed their relentless gaslighting and daily poison had successfully broken my mind. Derek eagerly offered to help me carry and load my heavy gear perfectly, playing the role of the supportive son, but I waved him off, claiming I desperately needed to do it myself to feel useful. I told them I was going to pack my bags and gather my tackle box from the study. Once I was safely out of their immediate sight, I moved with a rapid, calculated efficiency that completely betrayed my supposed severe cognitive decline. I pulled the 3 tiny black micro cameras from the shopping bag. They were incredibly sophisticated devices, no larger than a standard coat button, equipped with high-definition lenses, sensitive audio recording capabilities, and independent cellular transmitters. First, I quietly went into my home office. I knew Derek would inevitably use my private desk to finalize his fraudulent financial documents once he believed I was safely out of town. I carefully unscrewed the faceplate of the central air conditioning vent located above my leather desk chair. I secured the first micro camera inside the dark metal ductwork, angling the tiny lens to capture a perfect, unobstructed view of the keyboard and the computer monitor. I replaced the vent cover, ensuring the device was completely invisible from the ground. Next, I moved slowly into the formal dining room. The ceiling was adorned with a massive, ornate crystal chandelier that Cynthia had spent weeks selecting from a high-end boutique. I dragged a heavy wooden dining chair over to the center of the room and climbed up. I nestled the second micro camera deep within the glittering, faceted glass prisms. It provided a sweeping panoramic view of the entire room, a space where they frequently gathered to discuss their plans. Finally, I crept back toward the main living room. I waited patiently until I heard Cynthia humming in the kitchen and Derek walking upstairs to his old bedroom. I slipped the third camera into the thick, decorative molding of the fireplace mantel. This was the central hub of the house, the exact spot where they had sat drinking tea and exchanging triumphant glances just a few short minutes ago. With the traps securely set, I powered on my burner laptop for a brief moment to verify the hidden network connections. 3 crystal-clear, high-definition video feeds immediately popped onto the digital screen. My massive estate was now fully under my own private surveillance. I grabbed my canvas duffel bag and a dusty tackle box, carrying them out to the garage. I tossed the heavy gear into the trunk of my car, making a loud, deliberate show of checking my fishing inventory. Cynthia came out to the sunny driveway to see me off. She wrapped her slender arms around my neck, pressing a soft kiss to my cheek. "Have a wonderful time, darling," she murmured. "Please try to relax and forget about all this stressful financial nonsense." I looked down into her beautiful, lying eyes. "I will, Cynthia," I promised. "I am absolutely sure everything will be perfectly clear when I return." I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the estate. I drove exactly 10 miles down the busy interstate, monitoring the traffic behind me. I knew Cynthia and Derek would likely track the active GPS signal on my personal smartphone to verify I was actually heading toward Lake Lanier. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway, waiting patiently. A slow-moving open-bed cargo truck rumbled past me, hauling a massive load of scrap metal toward the distant northern county lines. I rolled down my window, took careful aim, and tossed my expensive smartphone directly into the rusted bed of the passing truck. My digital footprint was now heading to the remote lake separating from my actual physical location. I merged back onto the highway, taking the next exit and driving deep into an industrial sector of the city. I found a grimy, dilapidated motel sitting beside abandoned train tracks. It was the exact kind of shady place that only accepted cash and never asked for identification. The buzzing neon sign flashed a vacancy notice into the fading afternoon light. I walked into the dingy front lobby, paid for 3 nights in advance using the cash from my wallet, and took the rusty metal key from the apathetic clerk. I drove my sedan around to the back of the building, hiding it from the main road. I unlocked the peeling wooden door and stepped into the poorly lit room. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap floral cleaning chemicals. I locked the brass deadbolt, pulled the heavy blackout curtains completely shut, and set my new burner laptop on the scratched veneer desk. I was now a ghost, and it was officially time to watch the rats play. I unzipped my duffel bag and pulled out the power adapter for the new laptop, plugging it into the wall outlet near the scuffed wooden desk. The room was suffocatingly quiet, entirely devoid of the comforting sounds of my estate. There was only the low, rhythmic hum of the ancient air conditioning unit rattling in the window frame, and the occasional roar of a heavy freight train passing on the nearby tracks. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, opened the sleek monitor, and let the bright digital glow illuminate the dark-stained wallpaper. I connected the prepaid mobile hotspot, ensuring my digital footprint was completely untraceable, a solitary ghost operating in the forgotten shadows of the city. I was completely isolated, violently stripped of my wealth, and my status reduced to a paranoid old man hiding in a cheap motel room. But I had never felt more powerful or more sharply focused in my entire life. I typed in the complex alphanumeric sequences to access the secure administrative portal I had linked to the 3 micro cameras. A progress bar flashed across the screen, loading the encrypted video streams. 3 crisp, high-definition windows materialized on my monitor, each offering a silent, unblinking view into the heart of my own home. The first feed displayed my private study from the high vantage point of the air conditioning vent. The heavy oak desk sat perfectly undisturbed, the leather chair pushed neatly under the polished wood. The second feed showed the formal dining room captured through the glittering crystal prisms of the chandelier. The long mahogany table was empty, the afternoon sunlight filtering through the heavy silk drapes and casting long, stretching shadows across the imported rug. The third window provided a panoramic view of the main living room from the fireplace mantel. The house was entirely still. It was a beautiful, opulent cage that I had built with my own hands, and now it was occupied by predators. I sat in the dim motel room, watching the silent feeds, feeling a strange sense of detachment. I was observing my own life as a spectator, waiting for the facade of domestic tranquility to finally shatter. The waiting game was agonizing. Every minute that passed felt like an hour, the tension slowly wrapping around my chest like a tight iron band. I needed a distraction, a secondary line of attack, to dismantle the financial bomb Derek had planted inside Caldwell Holdings. I opened a new, highly encrypted browser window on the burner laptop. I needed to trace the exact origin and the ultimate destination of the fraudulent $15 million commercial loan Derek had just initiated. I knew the internal corporate servers would only show the superficial routing numbers, the clean fabricated surface of a much deeper criminal operation. I needed someone who could penetrate the dark, unregulated networks of the shadow lenders Derek was using. I navigated to a secure, decentralized online forum, a hidden marketplace where digital mercenaries offered their specialized services to the highest bidder. I had dealt with corporate espionage before, and I knew how to find the right kind of talent. I posted a carefully worded anonymous request detailing the specific parameters of the financial trace I required. I offered a massive upfront payment in untraceable cryptocurrency, ensuring my job would immediately attract the most elite cybersecurity experts on the network. Within 10 minutes, a secure encrypted message popped onto my screen. The sender used a simple numerical alias. They demanded a secondary verification of the funds and requested the initial routing packets for the $15 million loan. I transferred a significant portion of the digital currency into a secure escrow account and forwarded the data packets I had extracted from the Caldwell Holdings mainframe earlier that afternoon. The anonymous expert confirmed receipt and stated the trace would take approximately 3 hours to complete. They warned me that the shadow lenders used incredibly complex, multi-layered routing protocols to obscure their identities, bouncing the funds through dozens of offshore shell companies before reaching the final destination. I typed a brief reply instructing them to map every single layer, no matter how deep the rabbit hole went. I wanted the names of the corporate entities, the physical locations of the offshore accounts, and the identities of the primary beneficiaries. I needed undeniable absolute proof that Derek was conspiring with dangerous illicit entities to launder money through my legitimate business. The digital mercenary signed off, leaving me completely alone with the silent video feeds of my empty house. The sun was rapidly setting outside the dirty motel window, casting long, dark shadows across the cracked pavement of the parking lot. The neon vacancy sign flickered to life, buzzing with a persistent, annoying frequency that bled through the thin walls of my room. I sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable wooden chair, my eyes locked onto the glowing monitor. The formal dining room remained dark. The private study was undisturbed. The main living room was a quiet portrait of expensive, hollow luxury, an absolute monument to the decades of relentless, backbreaking labor I had freely given to my deceitful family. I drank a bottle of tepid water I had purchased from the vending machine down the hall, the cheap plastic crinkling loudly in the suffocating silence. I was a wealthy, respected structural engineer, a man who had commanded thousands of employees and built towering skyscrapers, currently eating stale crackers in a roadside motel, hiding from my own wife and stepson. The sheer absurdity of the situation threatened to overwhelm my rational mind, but I forced the rising panic down, locking it away in a dark corner of my brain. I could not afford to succumb to emotion. I needed cold, mechanical precision to execute my plan flawlessly and ensure their complete destruction. The digital clock on my laptop screen slowly ticked past 8 in the evening. I had been sitting in the dark room for nearly 5 hours. My back was stiff, and my eyes were burning from the harsh glare of the monitor. And then finally movement. The main living room feed flickered as the heavy front doors swung open. Cynthia and Derek walked into the grand foyer, completely unaware of the invisible eye watching their every move from the fireplace mantel. Cynthia dropped her designer handbag onto the polished entryway table, letting out a loud theatrical sigh of relief. The mask of the devoted, worried wife instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating hardness that chilled me to the bone. Derek loosened his expensive silk tie, a relaxed, confident smile spreading across his face. He walked directly toward the custom liquor cabinet in the corner of the living room, pouring 2 generous glasses of premium scotch. He handed one to his mother, raising his own glass in a silent, mocking toast to the empty house. I leaned closer to the monitor, turning the audio feed up to the maximum volume. It was officially time to listen to the brutal, unvarnished truth, to uncover the exact depth of their treachery, and to quietly prepare the devastating trap that would ultimately end their reign of deception. I stared at the flickering monitor, watching the woman I married clink her crystal glass against the glass of my treacherous stepson. The audio feed hissed slightly before capturing the chilling sound of their shared laughter. They were celebrating their perceived victory, basking in the glow of their successful theft and my supposed cognitive decline. Before I could process their spoken words, a sharp, piercing electronic ring shattered the suffocating silence of my motel room. It was the prepaid burner phone I had purchased along with the laptop. I had provided this specific, untraceable number to the private reception desk at the toxicology laboratory. My heart executed a painful, heavy thud against my ribs as I looked away from the monitor and stared at the small plastic device vibrating on the scratched veneer desk. They had promised expedited results within 48 hours, but barely 24 hours had passed since I handed over the unlabeled dark glass vial. A premature phone call usually meant one of 2 things. Either the sample was hopelessly contaminated, or the chemical composition was so dangerous that it triggered an immediate alert. I reached out with a trembling hand, took a deep breath to steady my pulse, and pressed the button to accept the incoming call. I brought the phone to my ear and answered with a quiet, raspy voice. A man introduced himself as Dr. Aris, the senior toxicologist, overseeing the priority chemical analysis at the downtown private facility. His tone was not the standard detached professional cadence I expected from a laboratory technician. His voice was incredibly tight, laced with urgent concern. He asked me to confirm my identity using the altered name and the secure identification number I had provided on the intake forms. After I recited the correct numerical sequence, the doctor let out a heavy sigh that sounded remarkably loud over the cheap cellular connection. He told me that he had personally expedited the mass spectrometry and the liquid chromatography tests because the initial reagent reactions were highly abnormal. He paused for a moment, and I could hear the faint rustling of paper as he presumably reviewed my printed diagnostic chart. He asked me with a striking level of directness how exactly I had come into possession of the liquid inside that vial, and more importantly, if I had ingested any of it myself. I swallowed hard, staring blankly at the stained floral wallpaper. I lied, telling him I found it among the belongings of a sick relative. The doctor was silent for another long moment before he began to read the final, horrifying conclusions of his chemical analysis. The liquid inside the dark vial was not a dietary supplement. It was not a holistic herbal remedy, and it was certainly not a standard prescription medication. Dr. Aris explained that it was a highly sophisticated, meticulously synthesized chemical cocktail designed with a singular, malicious purpose. The base of the fluid contained a dangerous concentration of heavy metals, specifically microscopic traces of thallium and lead, which accumulate slowly within the soft tissues of the body over an extended period. But the heavy metals were only the delivery mechanism. The true horror lay in the active pharmaceutical ingredients mixed into the toxic slurry. The doctor described a potent blend of unregulated black market sedatives and powerful neurotoxins that crossed the blood-brain barrier with terrifying efficiency. These were not chemicals you could simply purchase at a local pharmacy or accidentally mix together in a kitchen sink. This was a deliberate, weaponized poison that required specialized knowledge to formulate. I felt the ambient temperature in the cheap motel room plummet. A cold, paralyzing dread spread from my chest outward, numbing my fingertips and freezing the breath in my lungs. I asked him, my voice cracking slightly, despite my best efforts to remain stoic. What would happen to a person who ingested several drops of this specific mixture every single day? The response from Dr. Aris was a brutal death sentence delivered through the small speaker of the burner phone. If you take this daily, your brain will physically deteriorate, the doctor warned, articulating every single syllable with absolute chilling clarity. It mimics rapid-onset Alzheimer's disease and severe dementia. It degrades the neural pathways, deliberately destroying memory retention, basic motor skills, and spatial awareness. Whoever gave you this is trying to destroy your mind without leaving physical bruising or obvious signs of external trauma. If a standard physician were to examine a patient suffering from this specific chemical exposure, they would simply diagnose them with aggressive age-related cognitive decline. It is an insidious, cowardly way to erase a human being. The doctor urged me to contact the local authorities immediately, stating that the possession of this compound was highly illegal, and its application was attempted murder. I thanked him for his diligent work, assured him I would handle the situation appropriately, and abruptly ended the call. I placed the plastic phone back onto the desk, my hands shaking so violently that I had to clench them into tight fists to maintain control. The truth crashed down upon me with the crushing weight of a collapsing concrete structure. My wife, the woman who had sworn to love and cherish me, the woman who smiled at me over our morning coffee, was literally poisoning my brain. She was not just trying to steal my wealth. She was actively trying to trap me inside my own failing body, reducing me to a helpless, drooling vegetable who could not even remember his own name, let alone fight back against her financial treachery. I slowly turned my gaze back toward the glowing laptop monitor. On the screen, the high-definition feed from the fireplace mantel showed Cynthia lounging comfortably on our expensive Italian leather sofa. She was holding her crystal glass of scotch, throwing her head back in a silent fit of laughter at something Derek had just said. She looked radiant, elegant, and perfectly relaxed. The profound, sickening contrast between her beautiful exterior and her murderous, rotten soul made a wave of bile rise in my throat. In tone. Every cup of tea she had so lovingly brewed, every gentle hand she had placed on my forehead when I complained of migraines, every sweet word she had offered while I struggled to remember my daily schedule, it was all a lethal performance. She was watching me slowly die, and she was thoroughly enjoying the process. Hot tears of absolute fury welled in my eyes. I had spent 40 years building an empire, providing an incredibly lavish lifestyle for a woman who viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle to be systematically eradicated. The sheer cruelty of her method was staggering. A quick bullet would have been infinitely more merciful. Instead, she had chosen to steal my dignity, my intellect, and my very identity, drip by toxic drip. Derek refilled her glass, his arrogant posture radiating a false sense of absolute security. They thought they had entirely won. They thought the clueless old man was safely hidden at a remote lake waiting for his mind to snap. I made a silent, unbreakable vow to completely destroy them. The high-definition feed from the fireplace mantel offered a flawlessly clear, unobstructed view of my own living room. The warm evening light had faded, replaced by the soft ambient glow of the expensive crystal lamps I had installed for Cynthia on our 10th anniversary. Derek walked over to the custom-built mahogany wet bar, his movements loose and fluid. He reached into the climate-controlled wine refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of vintage champagne. I recognized the gold foil and the distinctive label instantly. It was a rare, incredibly expensive reserve that I had purchased years ago, specifically saving it to celebrate the birth of my first grandchild. Derek gripped the cork, twisting it with a practiced ease. The subtle pop echoed through the small speakers of my burner laptop, followed immediately by the bubbling hiss of the expensive vintage pouring into 3 crystal flutes. Monica stepped into the frame, her sharp heels clicking against the imported hardwood floor. She took a glass from her husband, holding it up to the light to admire the rising bubbles. She was wearing a silk dress purchased with my corporate credit card, her face glowing with a toxic mixture of greed and immense satisfaction. They gathered around the low-glass coffee table, bringing their flutes together in a celebratory toast. The delicate clink of the crystal glasses was a sharp, mocking sound in the quiet isolation of my motel room. They were drinking my private reserve, standing in the center of the home I had built, with decades of grueling labor celebrating my imminent demise. I leaned closer to the monitor, turning the audio feed up until a faint electronic hiss filled the background. I needed to hear every single syllable of their treason. I needed the digital recording software to capture the undeniable proof of their conspiracy. Monica took a long, slow sip of the champagne, closing her eyes in exaggerated delight. She lowered the glass and looked directly at Cynthia, a wicked conspiratorial grin spreading across her face. "I spoke with the estate lawyer again this afternoon," Monica said, her voice carrying a light conversational tone that completely belied the horrifying nature of her words. "He assured me that the paperwork is completely finalized and ready to be filed with the county court." Derek wrapped an arm around the waist of his wife, pulling her close. "And what is the exact timeline on the filing?" Derek asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Monica let out a short, melodic laugh that made my blood run cold. "The lawyer said we just need to document a few more severe cognitive lapses," Monica replied cheerfully. "If the old man continues to show a failing memory for just one more week, we will have more than enough established medical grounds to officially file for a full conservatorship. We can declare him entirely incompetent. Once the judge signs that order, we will have complete, unquestionable legal control over his entire estate. His bank accounts, his commercial properties, his stock portfolios, every single asset will be transferred into our administrative care. He will not be able to write a check, sell a piece of land, or even hire a lawyer to fight back. He will be completely powerless." I sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable wooden chair, my breathing shallow and remarkably slow. A conservatorship. The word hung in the stale air of the motel room like a heavy executioner blade. They did not just want to steal the $15 million through fraudulent corporate loans. They wanted to strip me of my fundamental human rights. They intended to cage me within my own failing mind, reducing me to a legal ward of the state, while they systematically drained the massive fortune I had accumulated over a lifetime. Cynthia stared down at her champagne flute, swirling the golden liquid with a slow, hypnotic motion. The radiant smile she had worn earlier slowly dissolved, replaced by a deep, ugly scowl of profound irritation. She looked up at Derek and Monica, her beautiful features twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. "One more week of this ridiculous charade feels like an absolute eternity," Cynthia complained, her voice dripping with a sickening blend of boredom and cruelty. "I am so incredibly tired of having to sneak those toxic drops into his morning coffee and his evening tea. I have to constantly watch him, constantly gauge his reactions, and constantly pretend to be the worried, doting wife every time his eyes glaze over. It is utterly exhausting." She took a heavy gulp of the champagne, swallowing it down before continuing her horrifying rant. "He is stronger than the supplier anticipated," Cynthia muttered darkly. "The chemical compound is definitely degrading his memory, but his physical constitution is stubbornly resisting the sedatives. He still asks too many questions about the banking ledgers. He still tries to manage those mundane property taxes. We cannot afford to have him pushing back when the commercial shadow lenders start calling about the $15 million loan you just initiated, Derek. The timing has to be absolutely perfect." Cynthia set her empty crystal glass down on the coffee table with a sharp, definitive clatter. She looked directly at her son, her eyes devoid of any lingering shred of human empathy. "I am done playing the patient nurse," Cynthia stated coldly. "When Richard gets back from that pathetic fishing trip on Monday, we are accelerating the timeline. I am going to completely stop measuring the dosage. Let us just double the exact amount of drops in his evening tea. We will flood his system and permanently break his cognitive function. We will give the lawyer his final medical incident, and we will finally be done with this miserable old fool. The sheer absolute brutality of her statement echoed loudly through the cheap speakers of my burner laptop. Double the dose. According to the senior toxicologist I had spoken with mere hours ago, rapidly doubling the concentration of those specific heavy metals and black market neurotoxins would not simply induce a state of severe dementia. A massive sudden overdose of that highly lethal chemical cocktail would trigger catastrophic neurological failure. It would shut down my major organs and stop my heart. Cynthia was no longer casually talking about establishing a fraudulent legal conservatorship to control my financial assets. My wife was actively openly planning my immediate murder in the center of my own living room. I reached out with a perfectly steady hand and pressed the command key to securely save the captured video file to the encrypted hard drive. I now possessed everything I needed. I had the undeniable chemical analysis from the private toxicology laboratory. I had the highly restricted offshore banking data proving Derek had forged my digital signature. And now I held the crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording of their explicit conspiracy to commit homicide. I sat back in the shadows of the silent motel room, a cold, relentless determination hardening my soul into solid steel. They eagerly wanted a completely broken, helpless old man to return home on Monday. I was going to give them a heavily armed, incredibly wealthy ghost. I sat in the suffocating silence of the dimly lit motel room, the horrifying echo of my wife openly planning my murder still ringing loudly in my ears. My breathing was intentionally slow and measured, a forced mechanical rhythm required to keep the rising tide of absolute fury from clouding my analytical judgment. Before I could fully process the sheer breathtaking depravity of her spoken words, a soft, sharp chime broke the heavy, oppressive stillness of the cheap room. It was a secure notification from my newly purchased burner laptop. The underground cybersecurity expert I had hired earlier that afternoon had just delivered the requested intelligence. I leaned forward, my face bathed in the harsh blue light of the monitor, and opened the highly encrypted digital dossier. The hacker had been incredibly thorough, mapping out a vast, terrifyingly complex labyrinth of international wire transfers, hidden shell companies, and offshore banking registries. I scrolled through the dense cascades of financial data, systematically peeling back the intricate digital disguises Derek had foolishly believed were completely impenetrable. The definitive origin of the pending $15 million commercial loan was not a desperate domestic hedge fund or a greedy private equity firm looking for quick returns. The ultimate parent entity, deeply buried beneath dozens of carefully fabricated corporate layers, was a notorious shell corporation heavily flagged by international intelligence agencies. My heart turned to solid ice as I read the attached security brief. My arrogant stepson was actively borrowing $15 million from a ruthless transnational crime syndicate. The sheer scale of his reckless stupidity was truly staggering. I immediately dug deeper into the appended transaction logs the mercenary had provided, searching for the underlying motive behind this blatantly suicidal financial maneuver. The expert hacker had successfully traced the final destination of the previous corporate funds Derek had already embezzled from my company. He had not been secretly investing in legitimate commercial real estate, nor had he been expanding the operational footprint of Caldwell Holdings. Derek had been systematically funneling millions of dollars of stolen corporate capital into a massive, highly leveraged, and entirely fraudulent international cryptocurrency operation. The digital ledgers painted a perfectly clear picture of absolute catastrophic failure. The unregulated digital exchange he had poured my money into had completely imploded just 3 days ago, wiping out its entire liquidity pool in a matter of hours. Derek had lost every single penny of the initial stolen funds. He was now deeply, irreversibly in debt to a violent criminal cartel. The pending $15 million loan was not a strategic investment plan. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to secure immediate exit capital, and he was intentionally using my pristine name, my unblemished company reputation, and my personal assets as his final doomed collateral. I stared at the glowing screen, my mind racing through the horrific legal and physical implications of his actions. If this massive loan was finalized and subsequently defaulted, the violent men behind that shell corporation would not send polite collection letters. They would send armed, merciless enforcers directly to my front door, aggressively looking for the elderly man whose verified digital signature was permanently stamped on the binding contract. My dark train of thought was abruptly severed by a sudden sharp spike in volume from the secondary monitor. I turned my attention back to the live video feed broadcasting from the hidden camera nestled inside my living room fireplace mantel. The atmosphere of arrogant celebration had rapidly evaporated. Derek was now pacing frantically back and forth across the expensive imported rug, the crystal champagne flute swinging wildly in his trembling hand. His tailored suit jacket was discarded, and his previously confident demeanor had entirely fractured, revealing the raw manic energy of a cornered animal, suddenly realizing the walls were rapidly closing in. Cynthia and Monica sat perfectly still on the luxurious leather sofa, watching him with wide, deeply frightened eyes. Derek abruptly stopped pacing and turned to face them, his chest heaving as he outlined the darkest, most cowardly phase of their betrayal. "Once we get legal control of his accounts tomorrow," Derek said, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of absolute panic and frantic anticipation. "We transfer the remaining cash to Switzerland and fly out. We do not pause to pack our bags. We do not say any goodbyes to our friends. We just leave everything behind and vanish into the night." Cynthia looked up at her son, her face deathly pale in the warm ambient light of the living room, but she offered a slow, resolute nod of agreement. Derek took a deep, shaky breath and continued speaking, revealing the true, monstrous depths of his cowardice. "The mob will come looking for the 15 million, he explained, his dark eyes darting nervously around the room, as if expecting the ruthless cartel assassins to step directly out of the shadows. But all the signatures are in Richard's name. The digital paper trail we created is completely flawless and entirely binding. Let the cartel and the FBI deal with the crazy old man. By the time anyone realizes what actually happened here, we will be resting comfortably on a remote beach in Geneva, completely untouchable." I sat back in the cheap wooden chair of the motel room, letting the crushing absolute reality of their sinister master plan wash over me. They were not merely going to destroy my cognitive function and lock me away in a sterile medical facility. They were intentionally serving me up as the perfect, defenseless, sacrificial lamb. They fully intended to leave me behind to face the brutal, uncompromising wrath of a betrayed international crime syndicate, or to rot in a maximum security federal penitentiary as a disgraced massive fraudster, all while my brain slowly melted from Cynthia's toxic chemical cocktail. The sheer breathtaking malice of their conspiracy extinguished any lingering shred of paternal mercy I might have unknowingly harbored in my heavy heart. The time for silent observation and careful evidence gathering was officially over. I carefully unplugged the burner laptop, sliding the device into my leather satchel alongside the definitive toxicology report. I stood up in the dark, silent motel room, my posture completely rigid, my mind operating with the cold, unyielding precision of a seasoned structural engineer preparing for a controlled, explosive demolition. They eagerly anticipated the return of a broken compliant and thoroughly poisoned old victim tomorrow morning. I was going to deliver a devastating storm of absolute uncompromising justice. I reached into my canvas duffel bag and pulled out a heavy steel combination lockbox, the only piece of luggage that truly mattered. Inside rested the original, unadulterated master deeds to the estate and the physical backup drives containing my uncompromised biometrics. Derek believed the digital realm was his invincible fortress, but I operated in the tangible, unforgiving world of iron concrete and hard paper trails. I opened the lockbox and placed the fresh electronic evidence inside, securing the final nails into their metaphorical coffins. The cartel might be hunting for 15 million stolen dollars, but my treacherous stepson and my murderous wife were about to discover that the real monster in this dark narrative was the man they underestimated. My immediate burning impulse was to dial the federal authorities and drop the entire mountain of damning evidence right onto their laps. It would have been incredibly satisfying to watch a tactical team kick down the heavy mahogany doors of my estate and drag Cynthia and Derek out in handcuffs. But the cold, rational part of my brain quickly vetoed that emotional urge. If I involved the federal government right now, the first thing they would do is freeze every single asset associated with Caldwell Holdings pending a massive multi-year criminal investigation. My life savings, the legitimate capital I had bled for over 4 decades, would be entirely locked in bureaucratic limbo. Furthermore, an ongoing federal audit would not automatically erase the immediate physical threat of an international crime syndicate looking for their missing $15 million. I needed a solution that was far more surgical, a devastating countermeasure that completely severed my personal liability while simultaneously dropping the cartel debt directly onto the head of the man who had stolen it. I reached into my leather satchel and pulled out my encrypted burner phone. I bypassed the local police entirely and dialed the direct private line of Harrison Cole. Harrison was my corporate attorney. He was not a man you hired to review gentle neighborhood property disputes or draft simple family wills. Harrison was a ruthless, cold-blooded legal shark who operated in the deep, murky waters of international corporate finance. He was a man who specialized in hostile takeovers, aggressive asset protection, and completely dismantling opposing counsel. The phone rang only twice before his sharp, gravelly voice cut through the static. It was past midnight, but men like Harrison never truly slept. I quickly gave him the encrypted authentication code we had established years ago for severe corporate emergencies. I told him I was calling from a highly secure, untraceable line, and that we needed to initiate an immediate, fully encrypted video conference. He did not ask any pointless questions. He simply provided a secure routing address. I opened my burner laptop and established the secure connection. The high-definition camera flickered, and Harrison appeared on my screen. He was sitting in his expansive downtown office surrounded by towering stacks of legal briefs, looking as sharp and alert as a predator smelling blood in the water. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the entire horrific narrative with mechanical precision. I explained the heavy metals Cynthia was feeding me. I showed him the toxicological report. I detailed Derek intercepting the network, forging my digital signature, bankrupting his own cryptocurrency scam, and borrowing $15 million from a notorious transnational syndicate using my company as his shield. I played him the chilling audio clip of my wife and stepson cheerfully planning my murder and their imminent flight to Switzerland. Harrison listened to the entire presentation without showing a single flicker of emotion. He did not offer useless sympathy or gasp in shock. His eyes simply narrowed, calculating the legal angles at lightning speed. When I finished, the heavy silence of the motel room was broken only by the rhythmic tapping of his expensive pen against his glass desk. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the smooth surface. He told me that calling the authorities now would be a catastrophic tactical error. He agreed that we needed to construct a financial firewall so thick and so absolute that neither the federal government nor the criminal cartel could ever touch me. We needed to legally amputate Derek from the safety of the corporate entity. I opened the digital lockbox containing the master deeds and the foundational administrative documents of Caldwell Holdings. I shared my screen with Harrison, granting him full access to the deepest administrative archives of the company. We worked together through the dead of night, 2 old men hunting for a fatal flaw in the armor of an arrogant thief. We scoured every contract Derek had ever signed, every internal memo he had authorized, and every tax document he had filed since I foolishly granted him his administrative access. It was 3 a.m. when Harrison suddenly let out a low, predatory chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. He instructed me to pull up a specific file from the corporate archives dated exactly 2 years ago. I navigated through the digital folders and opened the document. It was a dense, incredibly tedious corporate tax filing. 2 years ago, Derek had practically begged me to let him restructure a minor subsidiary of Caldwell Holdings to exploit a temporary federal tax break. He had sworn it would save the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in capital gains. I had given him the authorization to handle it, assuming it was a harmless exercise in corporate accounting. Harrison pointed to a specific subsection buried on the 14th page of the filing. It was a comprehensive corporate liability waiver. In his desperate, greedy rush to secure the tax break and claim credit for the financial victory, Derek had blindly signed a binding indemnification clause. The legal phrasing was dense and convoluted, but Harrison translated it with terrifying clarity. By signing that specific document, Derek had legally assumed absolute unlimited personal liability for any high-risk financial instruments or unauthorized loans initiated under that specific subsidiary umbrella. He had completely bypassed the protective corporate veil. He had signed away his legal immunity just to save a few tax dollars. Harrison's fingers flew across his own keyboard. He immediately began drafting a series of emergency corporate resolutions, utilizing my absolute founder-level authority. He was not just closing the loophole. He was actively weaponizing it. He drafted a binding legal instrument that retroactively transferred 100% of the fraudulent $15 million syndicate debt away from the Caldwell Holdings corporate structure and attached it permanently and strictly to the personal Social Security number of Derek. The moment these documents were filed with the Central Banking Authority, Derek would no longer be hiding behind my forged signature. The debt would be his alone, completely unshielded by any corporate bankruptcy protections. With the trap for Derek perfectly set, Harrison seamlessly shifted his focus to protecting my legitimate wealth. We could not leave my decades of hard-earned capital sitting in vulnerable domestic accounts where Cynthia could potentially access them, or a judge could freeze them during the inevitable fallout. I authorized Harrison to initiate a massive coordinated liquidation protocol. We quietly sold off my accessible liquid assets, closed my high-yield investment portfolios, and emptied the massive personal cash reserves I had spent my entire life building. We moved the money fast and hard, routing millions of dollars through a dizzying maze of secure institutional transfers. Harrison established an impenetrable, completely anonymous offshore trust located in a highly secretive jurisdiction that did not recognize domestic civil judgments or comply with standard federal asset seizures. We funneled the entirety of my life savings into the dark, silent vault of the offshore account. We stripped my domestic identity completely bare. On paper, Richard Caldwell was rapidly becoming a man with a heavily mortgaged estate, a failing company loaded with toxic debt, and a brain allegedly rotting from dementia. But in reality, I was securely holding the keys to an invisible fortune, while my stepson was blindly holding a $15 million grenade. The sun began to rise outside my cheap motel window, casting a pale, sickly light across the stained wallpaper. My eyes burned from exhaustion, and my hands ached from typing, but the adrenaline surging through my veins made me feel entirely invincible. Harrison finalized the last digital transfer, stamping the electronic seals onto the heavily encrypted trust documents. He looked at me through the camera, a grim smile playing on his lips. The federal filings were queued up and scheduled to execute automatically at exactly 9 in the morning, right when the financial markets opened. I closed the burner laptop, plunging the small room back into dim shadows. The digital execution was officially complete. Cynthia and Derek were going to wake up in a few hours, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire universe had just been fundamentally rewritten. They thought they were the architects of a brilliant, murderous financial coup. They had no idea they were simply rats walking happily into a steel trap, entirely unaware that the heavy metal door was already swinging shut right behind them. I packed my few belongings into the canvas duffel bag as the pale morning sun climbed higher into the hazy sky. I checked the motel room one last time to ensure I left absolutely nothing behind, returning the heavy brass key to the apathetic clerk at the front desk. The drive back to the sprawling estate was a stark contrast to my frantic escape just a few days prior. I drove with a profound, terrifying calm. The storm had finally broken, and I was riding the eye of the hurricane directly toward my treacherous family. I was returning a full 24 hours earlier than my fabricated itinerary dictated. I knew they were planning to accelerate their timeline, so I decided to graciously oblige them and significantly accelerate my own. I turned onto the long, winding driveway of my property, the tires crunching softly against the pristine gravel. The massive stone facade of my home looked exactly the same as it always did, an imposing monument to my decades of relentless labor, but it now felt entirely alien. It was no longer a warm sanctuary. It was a hostile battlefield. I parked my sedan quietly near the side entrance, deliberately avoiding the main garage bays, where the loud mechanical doors would announce my premature arrival. I retrieved my leather satchel, feeling the reassuring weight of the hard evidence securely resting inside. I unlocked the heavy oak side door with a slow, deliberate twist of my key, pushing it open without making a single sound. The house was unnervingly quiet, yet the air felt thick and heavily charged with anticipation. I walked down the long, polished marble hallway toward the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing faintly against the high vaulted ceilings. I took a deep, steadying breath and rounded the corner into the main living room. The scene that greeted me was meticulously orchestrated, a perfectly staged ambush waiting for the clueless old man to stumble blindly into the crosshairs. They were all gathered around the expensive glass coffee table. Cynthia was perched nervously on the edge of the leather sofa. Derek stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed defensively over his chest. Monica sat next to a man I had never seen before, a nervous-looking individual in a slightly wrinkled gray suit who clutched a leather medical bag. Beside Derek stood another stranger, a sharp-featured, predatory man wearing an overly expensive pinstripe suit and an incredibly smug expression. The sudden, unexpected sight of me standing in the arched doorway completely shattered their careful choreography. Derek dropped his arms, his jaw falling slack in genuine surprise. Monica gasped loudly, a sharp intake of breath that betrayed her immediate panic. The two strangers exchanged a quick, confused glance completely derailed by my premature return. But Cynthia, a true master of deception, recovered her composure in a fraction of a second. She immediately launched into the sickening theatrical performance she had undoubtedly been rehearsing all weekend. She leaped up from the sofa and rushed across the room, her high heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. "Oh, Richard!" she cried out, her voice trembling with a perfectly calibrated mixture of relief and overwhelming sorrow. "You are home early. Thank God you are back safe." She threw her slender arms around my shoulders, pressing her face against my chest and releasing a series of dry, fabricated sobs. I stood completely rigid, refusing to return her embrace, feeling the cold, venomous reality of her presence. She pulled back slightly, gripping my arms tightly and staring up at me with wide, panicked eyes. "You look so terribly confused, darling," she whispered loudly, ensuring the two strangers in the room heard every single word. "You must have forgotten what day you were supposed to return. Your memory is slipping so fast, and we have been absolutely sick with worry about your declining mental state." Derek stepped forward flawlessly, adopting the role of the deeply concerned, dutiful son. "Dad, we had to intervene." Derek said, his voice thick with fake empathy. "We cannot let you wander around like this anymore. It is simply not safe for you." Cynthia gently guided me toward the leather sofa, her grip on my arm feeling more like a tight shackle than a loving touch. She gestured toward the two men waiting awkwardly by the coffee table. "We brought a doctor, Richard," she explained softly, wiping away a non-existent tear. "This is Dr. Arrington. He is a highly respected specialist in severe cognitive decline. We asked him to come here today to quietly evaluate your condition in the comfort of your own home." The man in the wrinkled suit offered a weak, unconvincing smile, a thoroughly bribed medical professional brought in to rubber stamp my execution. "And this is Mr. Sterling," Derek added, pointing to the sharp-featured lawyer. "He is an estate attorney who specializes in protective family asset management. We just want to help you, Dad. We want to make sure you are properly cared for as your mind continues to deteriorate." The sleazy lawyer stepped forward, snapping open his leather briefcase and extracting a thick stack of legal documents. He placed the heavy pile onto the glass table and uncapped an expensive silver fountain pen. "Mr. Caldwell," the lawyer began, his voice dripping with arrogance and condescension, "your family loves you very much, and they are incredibly concerned about your rapid mental deterioration. For your own physical and financial safety, we have prepared a comprehensive medical power of attorney and a voluntary conservatorship agreement. It simply transfers the burden of managing your complex estate and your healthcare decisions to your wife and your stepson. It is completely routine in cases of aggressive Alzheimer's disease." Cynthia pressed herself against my side, her hand rubbing my shoulder in a grotesque display of false affection. "You need to sign this, Richard," she murmured gently, leaning close to my ear. "It is for your own safety, darling. Let us take care of everything so you can just rest." The lawyer held the silver pen out toward me, offering it with a confident, predatory grin. I slowly reached out and took the cold metal instrument from his fingers. I did not look at the dense legal text. They were incredibly eager, practically holding their collective breath in absolute silence. They genuinely believed I was utterly defeated, a broken vessel completely devoid of any rational thought or independent agency. Derek subtly shifted his weight, his dark eyes locked onto the glittering nib of the fountain pen with an intense, ravenous hunger. Monica bit her lower lip, her manicured fingernails digging deeply into her palms to mask her raw excitement. The corrupt doctor nervously adjusted his cheap silk tie, already calculating his illicit monetary payout. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, a beautifully constructed snare designed to legally strip away my entire existence without firing a single actual bullet. I let the silence stretch deliberately, dragging out the agonizing tension of the room. I looked down at the heavy silver pen resting quietly in the palm of my hand. Then I slowly raised my head and looked directly at my family for a moment. I did not yell. I did not scream or throw the heavy silver pen across the expansive living room. The blinding white-hot fury that had carried me through the darkest hours of the night had completely crystallized into a supreme, freezing calm. I looked deeply into the terrified eyes of my wife, then shifted my gaze to the arrogant smirk of my treacherous stepson. The room was so overwhelmingly silent that I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the grand foyer. With a slow, deliberate movement, I placed the expensive fountain pen gently onto the polished glass surface of the coffee table. I picked up the thick stack of legal documents the sleazy lawyer had so confidently presented. The medical power of attorney and the voluntary conservatorship agreement felt heavy in my hands. Without breaking eye contact with Derek, I gripped the crisp paper and tore the entire stack completely in half. The sharp, tearing sound ripped through the quiet room like a physical gunshot. Cynthia gasped, stumbling backward until the back of her knees hit the edge of the leather sofa. She collapsed onto the cushions, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Derek stepped forward, his face instantly flushing with angry, indignant color. The corrupt doctor and the sleazy lawyer both froze, entirely unsure of how to react to an allegedly brain-damaged victim behaving with such aggressive, calculated clarity. "What do you think you are doing?" Derek demanded, his voice rising in absolute panic. "We are trying to help you." I ignored his pathetic outburst entirely. I reached into my leather satchel and extracted the 2 thick manila envelopes I had prepared. I tossed them carelessly onto the glass coffee table right on top of the shredded pieces of their failed legal snare. The heavy envelopes landed with a dull, authoritative thud. "I suggest you both read exactly what I have been doing while you were busy drinking my vintage champagne and planning my murder," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority. Derek was the first to lunge forward. He snatched the envelope bearing the official seal of Harrison Cole, his hands moving with frantic, desperate speed. He ripped open the flap and pulled out the crisp, newly minted corporate liability transfer documents. I watched closely as his eyes darted rapidly across the dense legal text. It took him exactly 10 seconds to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe he was holding. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly white. His knees buckled slightly, and he swayed on his feet, suddenly gasping for air, as if the oxygen had been violently sucked from the spacious room. He looked up at me, his dark eyes wide with a pure, unfiltered terror that I had never witnessed before. The $15 million commercial loan he had fraudulently initiated through my company was no longer shielded by the protective corporate veil of Caldwell Holdings. The debt and the ruthless international cartel attached to it now rested entirely and permanently upon his own personal Social Security number. "What did you do?" Derek whispered, his voice trembling so violently that the words barely escaped his throat. "You transferred the debt. You cannot legally do this to me. I simply closed the tax loophole you begged me to open 2 years ago," I replied, my tone completely devoid of mercy. "You signed a binding corporate liability waiver to save a few tax dollars, completely bypassing your own legal immunity. The moment you forged my signature to steal $15 million from a violent transnational crime syndicate, you activated that exact indemnification clause. You are solely responsible for every single penny of that cartel money, Derek. I have completely severed my company from your suicidal transaction. The shadow lenders will not be knocking on my front door. They will be coming directly for you." Derek dropped the papers onto the floor, clutching his chest as he began to hyperventilate. His entire grand scheme, the brilliant exit strategy to Switzerland, had just violently imploded, leaving him holding a live grenade. While Derek descended into a state of total panic, Cynthia slowly reached out and picked up the second manila envelope. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she extracted the detailed toxicology report from the downtown laboratory. She read the bold black letters outlining the presence of heavy metals and black market neurotoxins. I watched her beautiful, deceptive face contort into a mask of absolute horror. She realized in that exact devastating moment that her lethal secret was completely exposed. The toxic chemical cocktail she had been feeding me for months was no longer a silent, invisible weapon. It was meticulously documented physical evidence of attempted murder. Cynthia looked at me, tears streaming down her cheeks, but this time they were not fake. They were the genuine tears of a cornered predator, realizing the trap had snapped firmly shut around her own neck. "Richard, please," she sobbed, dropping the laboratory report onto the table as if it were burning her fingers. "You have to understand. I did not want to hurt you. I was just overwhelmed." "You wanted to destroy my mind," I corrected her coldly, stepping closer to the sofa. "You wanted to trap me inside my own failing body while you and your son drained my life savings. You planned to double the dosage tonight, did you not?" "Cynthia, I heard everything. Every single word spoken in this room has been recorded and securely transmitted to a private offshore server. Your entire conspiracy to commit homicide is completely documented." The sleazy estate lawyer suddenly scrambled backward, grabbing his empty briefcase and bolting toward the front foyer without saying a single word. He recognized a sinking ship and desperately wanted to escape the blast radius. The bribed psychiatrist followed closely behind him, abandoning his medical bag on the floor as he sprinted for the exit. They left my family entirely alone to face the absolute ruin they had actively constructed for themselves. Monica, who had remained frozen in the background, suddenly grasped the terrifying reality of the situation. She looked at Derek, who was currently weeping on his knees, and then she looked at the front door. The illusion of immense wealth and a carefree life in Geneva had vanished, replaced by the imminent threat of cartel assassins in federal prison. Monica let out a sharp, hysterical cry. She turned on her heels, her expensive shoes sliding against the polished wood floor, and made a desperate run for the grand entryway. Derek weakly called out her name, but she completely ignored him, throwing open the heavy oak doors and sprinting down the long driveway. She was abandoning her husband to the wolves, a fitting conclusion to a marriage built entirely upon greed and deception. I stood in the center of my beautiful, opulent living room, looking down at the two people who had so eagerly plotted to end my life. Their vast empire of lies was finally shattered, leaving them completely vulnerable, stripped of all their stolen power, and waiting for the ruthless consequences of their treacherous actions. Derek remained on his knees for only a few seconds before the paralyzing weight of his terror morphed into a blind, animalistic rage. He looked at the torn legal documents, then at the liability transfer bearing his own name, and finally at me. His hands curled into tight fists. He let out a primal guttural roar that tore through his throat and pushed himself violently off the floor. He lunged directly at me, his eyes wide and completely devoid of any rational thought. He was a desperate coward who had just realized that his only remaining option was physical violence. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground, fully prepared to face the physical assault of the man who had tried to steal my life. But his hands never reached my throat. Before he could close the short distance between us, the heavy silence of the sprawling estate was completely shattered by a deafening, synchronized wail. A blinding cascade of pulsing red and blue lights suddenly erupted through the massive bay windows of the living room, slicing through the ambient shadows and painting the walls in frantic, strobing colors. The shrieking sirens echoed incredibly loudly. Derek froze mid-stride, his two arms suspended in the cold, empty air. The violent momentum completely drained from his body as he slowly turned his heavy head toward the front windows. Cynthia screamed a shrill, piercing sound of pure panic as the heavy oak front doors were violently kicked open. The thick wood splintered and cracked under the immense force of the sudden breach. A tactical swarm of heavily armed federal agents flooded into the grand foyer, their heavy boots thundering against the polished marble floor. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, fanning out across the entire first floor. Bright, tactical flashlights swept across the living room, instantly blinding Derek and Cynthia. A booming voice echoed through a handheld megaphone ordering absolutely everyone to get down on the ground and place their empty hands behind their heads. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of absolute justice. I remained standing perfectly still, raising my hands slowly to show I was completely unarmed and fully cooperative. Harrison Cole, my brilliant and utterly ruthless corporate attorney, had executed his final defensive maneuver exactly as we had carefully planned. Precisely 30 minutes before I walked through my front door, Harrison acted very deliberately. He had formally transmitted the entire digital package of encrypted evidence directly to the highest levels of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Financial Regulatory Commission. Two heavily armored agents rushed forward, grabbing Derek violently by his expensive suit jacket and slamming him forcefully onto the imported rug. He thrashed and kicked, screaming incoherently as they expertly pinned his flailing arms behind his back and secured his trembling wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable financial mastermind who drank my vintage champagne and openly mocked my failing memory just a few moments ago today. He was just a pathetic, broken criminal facing the absolute destruction of his entire universe. I slowly walked over to where he lay securely pinned against the floor. I knelt down beside him, completely ignoring the chaotic shouting of the armed federal agents securing the rest of the dark house. Derek looked up at me, his bruised face pressed painfully against the soft fibers of the rug. Hot tears of pure terror streaming down his pale cheeks. I leaned in extremely close, bringing my face just inches from his ear, ensuring my voice would cut clearly through the loud noise. "I am not losing my mind, son," I whispered slowly, my tone carrying the cold, unforgiving weight of a falling executioner blade. "I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly what you did, but you are about to lose your life. The federal agents are arresting you for massive corporate fraud and international money laundering. But remember, the transnational syndicate is still waiting for their $15 million, and they know your name." Derek let out a horrifying, strangled sob, finally comprehending the inescapable nightmare he had built for himself with his own two treacherous hands just today. The federal prison sentence would merely be a temporary sanctuary from the ruthless cartel assassins who would inevitably hunt him down the moment he was released, or perhaps even while he was incarcerated. I stood up and turned my undivided attention to my treacherous wife. Cynthia was violently fighting against two strong female agents who were trying to pull her up from the leather sofa. Her immaculate hair was wildly disheveled, and her expensive silk dress was tangled around her shaking knees. She shrieked my name repeatedly, pleading with me to tell them it was all a terrible, unfortunate mistake. She kept begging me to use my vast influence to stop the aggressive arrests. I looked at her without a single ounce of human mercy. An older, stern-faced federal agent wearing a dark windbreaker walked directly over to the glass coffee table and carefully picked up the manila envelope containing the detailed toxicology report. He scanned the printed document, his professional expression rapidly hardening into a rigid mask of pure disgust. Cynthia Caldwell. The agent announced loudly, his deep voice echoing powerfully through the grand living room over the continuing wail of the flashing police sirens crying endlessly outside. You are officially under arrest for the deliberate attempted murder of your husband, alongside formal charges of severe elder abuse and coordinated conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked sharply around her slender wrists, permanently silencing her desperate manipulative protests. They dragged her toward the shattered front entrance, leaving her shattered ego behind. The entire house swarmed with meticulous crime scene investigators, collecting my neatly arranged evidence. I watched them carry my ruined family out into the cold night air, feeling an immense, profound sense of ultimate peace completely wash over my newly liberated soul entirely, forever. The sleazy estate attorney who had attempted to legally bind me to a fraudulent conservatorship was already securely detained in the back of a black federal cruiser, weeping like a frightened child. The bribed psychiatrist was currently being aggressively interrogated by two highly aggressive investigators regarding his complicit role in Cynthia's homicidal scheme. I walked slowly toward the grand bay windows, looking out at the flashing red and blue lights that beautifully illuminated my sprawling front lawn. The dark, ominous storm that had threatened to entirely consume my life and erase my legacy had finally been decisively broken apart forever. I had completely severed their toxic influence from my hard-earned empire and secured my massive financial assets in an impenetrable offshore fortress. They had falsely believed they were outsmarting a vulnerable, declining old man, but they had simply awakened a sleeping giant. The house was finally quiet again, cleansed of their poisonous presence and their boundless greed. I took a deep, refreshing breath of the cool night air, ready to step forward into my newly reclaimed life. I was Richard Caldwell, completely unbroken, entirely victorious, and finally the absolute master of my own magnificent, thoroughly secured destiny once again. 6 months have passed since that dark, storm-filled night in Atlanta. I am now sitting comfortably on the expansive balcony of my new, highly secure luxury penthouse in Miami. The warm, salty ocean breeze washes over my face, carrying the sweet scent of freedom and absolute tranquility. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, savoring the rich, unadulterated flavor. There are no heavy metals hidden in my cup today. There are no black market sedatives clouding my thoughts or deteriorating my mind. I am 70 years old, completely lucid, and functioning with a terrifyingly sharp mental clarity that my enemies foolishly believed they had extinguished. I rest my ceramic mug on the polished glass table and tap the glowing screen of my sleek tablet. The digital newsfeed instantly refreshes, displaying the highly anticipated conclusion to a massive, sensational federal trial that has dominated the national headlines for weeks. The crisp, high-resolution photograph on the screen shows Derek and Monica being escorted out of a federal courthouse by armed marshals. They are both wearing heavy steel shackles and bright orange jumpsuits, their faces pale, gaunt, and completely drained of their former arrogance. The bold headline beneath their photograph announces their absolute ruin. They have been officially sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive corporate wire fraud, international money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. Their brilliant escape plan to Switzerland had violently disintegrated the moment Harrison Cole legally attached the $15 million cartel debt to Derek. The international crime syndicate had indeed come looking for their money, but the Federal Bureau of Investigation had found my treacherous stepson first. The government seized his passport, froze his remaining fraudulent accounts, and threw him into an isolated holding cell. The cartel, realizing their illicit funds were permanently lost in the complex web of federal confiscations, had immediately severed all ties, leaving Derek completely exposed to the merciless wrath of the American justice system. Monica had desperately tried to negotiate a plea deal by completely turning on her husband, but the irrefutable audio recordings I provided had securely tied her to every single aspect of the deadly conspiracy. She was going down right alongside the arrogant fool she had married. I swiped my finger across the smooth glass screen, moving to the secondary article detailing the separate state-level criminal proceedings. A second photograph materializes, showing Cynthia sitting behind a heavy wooden defense table, looking haggard, broken, and remarkably older than her years. The woman who had spent an entire decade carefully cultivating a flawless image of high society elegance was now permanently branded a violent monster. The physical evidence I had meticulously gathered against her was completely insurmountable. The private toxicology report, the hidden camera video files of her explicitly discussing the poison, and the specific chemical residue investigators found hidden in her private bathroom vanity had sealed her ultimate fate. She is currently facing 25 years in state prison for the deliberate attempted murder of her husband and aggravated elder abuse. She will spend the rest of her natural life locked inside a tiny concrete cell, completely stripped of her designer clothing, her imported champagne, and her stolen dignity. I lock the tablet screen, setting the device aside. The heavy, dark chapter of my life involving those 3 parasites is officially closed forever. I turn my attention to the thick, leather-bound portfolio resting on the table next to my coffee mug. The sprawling estate in Atlanta, the house I had built with my own hands, and filled with the painful echoes of their deception, no longer belongs to me. I instructed Harrison to completely liquidate the massive property, along with every other physical asset tying me to that treacherous city. The sweeping land, the crystal chandeliers, the mahogany wet bar, where they toasted my demise, it was all sold to an anonymous corporate developer. I took the massive influx of clean, legitimate cash and safely deposited it directly into my impenetrable, heavily guarded offshore trust. I opened the leather portfolio, revealing a stack of freshly drafted legal documents prepared by Harrison. This paperwork represents the beautiful, constructive future I am building from the ashes of my past. I pick up my favorite silver fountain pen, the exact same instrument the sleazy estate lawyer had once tried to use to steal my life. I carefully sign my name on the bottom line of the primary document, officially transferring a massive multi-million-dollar portion of my secured offshore wealth into a brand new, fully endowed educational trust. I have established a comprehensive scholarship fund specifically designed for young, brilliant, and hardworking engineering students who possess the raw talent but lack the necessary financial resources to achieve their dreams. I want to quietly fund the education of honest, dedicated builders. I want to actively support the creative minds who genuinely understand the immense value of hard work, structural integrity, and unyielding perseverance. I am choosing to invest my vast fortune in individuals who construct reliable foundations rather than entitled parasites who only know how to tear them down. By signing this document, I am effectively ensuring that my life savings will continuously generate positive, meaningful growth for generations to come. Derek and Cynthia desperately tried to steal my legacy, but I have completely redefined it on my own uncompromising terms. I close the leather portfolio and place the silver pen back into my pocket. I stand up from my comfortable chair and walk toward the edge of the glass balcony, leaning my hands against the smooth metal railing. The vibrant city of Miami stretches out endlessly before me, a beautiful, sprawling tapestry of gleaming skyscrapers, lush green palm trees, and sparkling blue water. The morning sun reflects brightly off the gentle ocean waves, filling the sky with a warm golden light that completely banishes the lingering shadows of my past. I take a long, deep breath of the crisp, salty air, letting it fill my lungs and invigorate my entire body. I am no longer a confused victim hiding in the dark. I am a survivor who successfully navigated the ultimate, most devastating betrayal imaginable. I protected my mind, I safeguarded my vast financial empire, and I delivered absolute, uncompromising justice to the very people who sought to end my life. I am completely in control of my own destiny, looking forward to a bright, quiet, and utterly secure future. I stand tall against the balcony railing, a wealthy, independent man who successfully weathered the storm and emerged stronger, sharper, and more resolute than ever before. I listen to the rhythmic crashing of the waves hitting the pristine shoreline directly below my towering building. The gentle, natural sound is a perfectly soothing contrast to the terrifying police sirens that concluded my darkest night. I have finally traded a massive mansion filled with treacherous lies for a tranquil penthouse filled with profound honesty. The magnificent structural integrity of my newly rebuilt life is now completely unassailable. I softly smile to myself, entirely ready to peacefully enjoy the beautiful dawn of my newly established kingdom and my newly reclaimed peace of mind today forever. The most dangerous mistake anyone can make is confusing a quiet demeanor with weakness. I spent decades building my empire, yet my own family assumed my age made me an easy target. They believed my silence was ignorance and my trust was stupidity. But a man who builds foundations knows exactly how to tear them down. Never let bloodlines blind you to the truth of someone's actions. Protect your mind, guard your assets, and remember that true family is defined by loyalty, not just a last name. Sometimes the only way to save your life is to burn the bridge. If this story opened your eyes to the harsh realities of family betrayal, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss my upcoming stories. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now today.